Okay, let us take a look at amplifiers, receivers, power amps, etc. What's going to be driving your speakers, things to consider when it comes to designing and building your home cinema. First of all, let's look at the audio system types. So right at the top, we've got the most common setup, which is just an AV receiver, oftentimes referred to as an AVR, driving passive speakers. Now, this is the most common because it is often the most cost-effective system, in that an AVR generally has enough driven channels, powered channels, as in it has built-in amplifiers to power the speakers to run most common surround sound setups. For instance, even an entry-level AVR would have 5 driven channels, so you can easily have a 5.1 system. Thing to note, if you're not already aware, subwoofers are never, or very rarely, at least as far as I've seen, powered by the AV receiver. There is always a subwoofer output, which is a low level or LFE feed, which goes to a separate amplifier or active subwoofer. But subwoofers will be a separate discussion altogether. We're just looking at amplifiers for the main surround channels for now. So an AV receiver driving passive speakers, the most common one. You can get 5 channel, 7 channel, 9, 11, 13, 15. I think the most complicated one I've seen was a 17 channel AVR, as in it had 17 driven channels. But these things are a beast and you pay a lot for them, so they are very unlikely to be the kind of thing that you will use in a DIY home cinema setup anyway. But it's worth being aware that they are indeed available. Then the next step, if you prefer to have slightly cleaner amplification of your speakers, of the audio, is to have just an AV processor. Now, you can use an AV receiver as a processor and use all of the pre-outputs or the preamp outputs, but you do get dedicated AV processors which only produce low-level outputs to be fed into a power amp or multiple power amps. So in that kind of setup, you would have the AV processor feeding into a power amp, and the power amp drives all of your speakers. Then you can have an AV processor, or again an AV receiver, use all the low line level outputs and just power or feed them into active speakers. And obviously active speakers have built-in amplifiers, so they just need to take a line level input and you get your audio out the other end. And then of course you have the very, or more so becoming a common thing in small surround sound systems, which is a soundbar with wireless sound. Normally these can be found in the form of a Sonos soundbar, for instance, with a pair of Sonos smaller speakers as your surrounds. Similarly, you get Sony, LG, Samsung. They all make these ready to go home cinema in a box experience, basically, where you get a soundbar with some detachable speakers that you can place at the back of the room for your surround channels. Now, while these may be the most cost-effective way to produce a surround sound system in your home cinema, they definitely do not have the same impact or produce the same immersive experience as having a proper AV receiver or power amp driving much larger speakers. Soundbars generally tend to have very, very small speakers, which means they can only drive so much sound out of them, so you don't get that same experience. Moving on to amplifier selection, it's good practice to consider and obviously take into account how many driven speaker channels you have in your home cinema. And on some amplifiers there will be a difference between the number of process channels and the number of driven channels, as in the number of amplifiers it has inside the box. A lot of amplifiers will have, say, 5 or 7 driven channels and offer 7, 9 or 11 channels of processing. That means let's take an example of an AV receiver with 7 driven channels, but it has 11 channel processing. So you can have 7 channels, so your 7 surround channels connected to outputs, and then feed the pre-outs for, say, 4 height channels to a power amp or a pair of stereo amps to power those speakers. So always consider how many audio channels you require, and make sure you specify an AV receiver that has the correct number of channels processed and channels driven for the amount of speakers you want, unless of course you're planning to add additional amplifiers. Then it's always worth looking at the available built-in features. So Denon and Marantz amplifiers, and a whole host of other ones as well, have room correction software built in, where you plug in a measurement mic, place it in the listening position, and the AV receiver, through a series of tones that it plays, calculates the size of the room and where all the walls are, and it uses clever sonic measuring basically, and it produces a more focused sound profile for your listening position. Now normally with these AV receivers where this feature is available, you can manually tune them as well, which is good, because not all AV receivers give you the ability to fully tune individual channels, how much power you want, or to create virtual distances, which adds a delay. So if you have an odd shaped room, for instance, where one speaker sits only 2 meters from the listening position and another one's maybe 5 meters away, if those speakers are not set up in a way that there is a slight delay, and I'm talking only milliseconds of delay between the two of them, it's going to sound like there's almost an echo effect in the room, because the sound is physically getting to your ears slower from one speaker than it is from the other. So it's very good to run these not diagnostics but calibrations to make sure the receiver is aware of the space that it is installed into. And then of course supported audio and video formats. If you want to run an Atmos system where there are height channels, make sure that the AV receiver actually supports decoding Atmos audio formats. Similarly, if you want to use Oro or any of the other surround sound, if you, say for instance, have a big collection of DVDs that rely on DTS, make sure the AV receiver supports DTS, for instance. The same goes for all the Dolby sound formats and everything else that's out there. So just check what formats you need and what's available. And then as a little bonus, we're looking at a quick case study of a surround sound system or surround sound setup type that a lot of people won't have even heard of. So Lithe Audio, I mentioned in a previous video. Live spelled L-I-T-H-E, sounds a lot like live, L-I-V-E, but yeah, Lithe Audio. They sell kits for installing 5-channel and 7-channel surround systems. So you can have a 5.1, 7.1 or a 5.1.2 Atmos system, and these are all active speakers, so they can be on wall or on ceiling mounted speakers, or surface mount speakers basically, or you can use in ceiling speakers, so round in ceiling, or you can use them in walls as well. And all you need at each speaker is mains power to power it up, and with some of the speakers you also have the option to hardwire it using Ethernet, so you don't even have to rely on it being wirelessly paired, etc. You can have that reliability of a hardwired connection. So mains power, optional Ethernet to each speaker location, and you don't need a receiver or any sort of a processor with this. So it uses the Wiser standard, and it has there are 2 types from Lithe Audio. There's a Wiser SoundSend or a Cinema Box or something like that they call it. Basically each one just takes a HDMI ARC audio return channel feed from your TV or whatever device it is you're using as the source for the audio and video, and it automatically decodes and sends all the audio data to the speakers. So there's no need for an AV receiver to even do the switching, because these are meant to be used or paired with a television, so the television becomes the source and the source switching device. Now it's worth noting, whilst this might sound like a possibly cheaper route compared to cabling for speakers and having AVRs, there's a very fine edge between the live audio system being more cost effective compared to a traditional system, but it does give you the advantage of, if you can't get speaker cables in, or if you do not physically have space for an AV receiver or processor and a load of amps, then this is the way to go. So yeah, first little case study there, live audio, and in future videos we'll delve a bit more into how these wireless systems work. Until then.